Hello everyone, it's Foo here, and today I want to talk about some big news for Spidops fans, of which there are apparently many. A lot of people thought this day would never come, but it turns out there is now officially proof that this polarizing Pokemon is actually not the worst Pokemon in competitive. Everyone expected Spidops to be atrocious due to its abysmally low base stat total of 404. Now this is super low, like there are very, very few fully evolved Pokemon that have such a low base stat total. Spidops is super slow, and it's pretty frail despite its acceptable defensive stats because it has such a low HP pool. And offensively, it's weak too due to low attacking stats, so it doesn't look like there's much hope there for Spidops. But Spidops has proved itself in the Smogon singles format, and we can tell this from the usage-based tiering system. So in Smogon, you have OU or overused, which is the highest tier. The strongest Pokemon will be used the most to get wins in this tier. Then you introduce the underused tier, or UU, in which you can only use Pokemon that are used on less than 4.52% of OU teams. Then you create rarely used, or RU, which is below UU, and you can only use Pokemon which are used on less than 4.52% of UU teams, and so on. And then we end up with OU, then UU, then RU, then NU, and as of March 2023, we have Scarlet and Violet PU, which is currently the lowest tier. Why this is relevant to Spidops is that Spidops has not dropped into PU. It's comfortably staying in NU with a whole Pokemon between it and the cutoff line to drop into PU. Okay, so it almost fell into PU, but still, this is a big feat for a Pokemon with only 404 base stats. So what is Spidops doing in NU that makes it good enough to keep it out of the lowest tier? Well, it's got a couple of niches. The first off is it gets access to Sticky Web, an entry hazard that drops the opponent's speed. This can be really, really useful just for keeping up your offensive pressure and being able to attack before the opponent. Not many Pokemon get access to this move. The other viable user of Sticky Web in the tier is Masquerain. Masquerain actually has usable offensive stats. It has a good special attack stat with a good special move pool and access to Quiver Dance, so it can put on some offensive pressure. Spidops is very different because it doesn't really have any way to set up or immediate offensive pressure, but that's where its other moves come in. So it does get other hazards, which are very valuable. So you can also use spikes and toxic spikes on Spidops, and it can be a real hazard setter. Additionally, it gets access to First Impression, which is a relatively rare bug type move. It's got a high base power and +2 priority, so it almost always moves first, and it moves before other priority moves like Aqua Jet, Sucker Punch, Quick Attack, and it can be a really useful revenge KO tool. What's even nicer for Spidops is that it gets the Stakeout ability, one of the most underrated abilities in the game and one of my favorite abilities, to the point where I've actually previously made a video about Stakeout before Scarlet and Violet came out, where I wished for there to be some more viable Stakeout Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. Whether Spidops really matches that definition, I'm not quite sure, but in the NU tier, definitely its Stakeout pressure can really help. Stakeout doubles the power of your move if the opponent switches out. So you can force some really awkward decisions for your opponent when you're threatening a KO with your First Impression that will move before the opponent because of its priority. The opponent can potentially switch out their Pokemon to preserve it, but then whatever comes in has to take double damage and may faint or take a massive chunk as well. So First Impression and Stakeout is actually a really neat combination. While Spidops doesn't have the most immediate pressure with First Impression, if you position it correctly and the opponent is weakened, you can create those powerful positions. And then the final piece to Spidops is that it does also get U-turn. Because it's quite slow, you can get some slow U-turns off, which gives you a lot of momentum, and equally these can get that Stakeout boost if the opponent does want to switch, which gives you a big hit onto their Pokemon and keeps you with that momentum. So the slow U-turn is quite nice, although you do have to bear in mind that Spidops is generally not so bulky. All of these things together really do differentiate Spidops from the other Sticky Web users in the tier. In terms of specific matchups, Spidops has a really good matchup into one of the best Pokemon in the tier, which is Bruxish. A water psychic type with a lot of power, its strong jaw boosted Psychic Fangs does so much damage, and it does have the option to set up with Sword Stance. It does get priority with Aquajet to help it sweep, but what's nice with Spidops is that first impression is super effective and out-prioritizes Aquajets for the one-hit KO onto Bruxish. You just have to watch out because it does have the option to run Dazzling, which protects it from priority moves, but the vast majority of the time they will be running Strong Jaws for that boost to the damage of their Psychic Fangs. Other Pokemon it has a good matchup into are things like Veluza, which is a Fillet Away setup Pokemon, and also Mabosstiff, which interestingly is another stakeout Pokemon that on paper I thought would be much better than Spidops, but both of them have ended up in the same tier. Now Mabosstiff is considered to be very viable in this tier, probably more viable than Spidops, but in the 1v1, Spidops definitely wins because first impression threatens the KO on Mabosstiff, and the opponent is forced to make that decision as to whether to switch out and give Spidops that stakeout boost. Other frail Pokemon that first impression can help against once they've been weakened slightly are things like Medicham, Honchkrow, and Jolteon. And then there are some more defensive Pokemon that are weak to bug-type moves like Umbreon and Lurantis that you see relatively commonly. Also, I believe that Cacturne is an underrated threat in the NU tier. It's actually dropped down to PU, but I could see it being used more in the upcoming months because Vaporeon, Sandaconda, and Umbreon are very common defensive picks, which are all very passive against Cacturne. So if Cacturne usage does rise up, then that's a very good use case for Spidops. Now I've presented all the good things that go in Spidops' favour. The best way to use it is definitely as a bulky, max attack invested Pokemon because you do need as much attack as you can get for that first impression to be at all threatening. With the max HP investment, Spidops generally can take non-super effective hits, which is pretty good. And for this set, you really have to run heavy duty boots because the pivoting with the U-turn is really important and switching in again and again to get those first impressions is necessary. So I would say that heavy duty boots is really the only item option for Spidops, unless you're going to go for a suicide lead and then Focus Sash might be better, but I don't really like using Spidops that way. Now I'm obligated to present the reality that Spidops is not the most viable Pokemon in this tier. In fact, some slightly outdated viability rankings for the NU tier did put Spidops as a low viability Pokemon. Things have significantly changed in the tier since then. There have been some big bans, but there are still some very common, important Pokemon that can really put a halt on Spidops' work. Things like Defog Braviary is a massive one. There's also things like Crocodile and also Quillfish, which takes no damage from Spidops attacks and can set up even more hazards in its face. I would say that these don't completely ruin Spidops' viability if you apply the correct pressure with a lot of momentum switching and going for U-turn with Spidops when you can make that prediction, then you can keep momentum and chip away at these Pokemon and take them out. But it is worth noting that even with the stakeout boost, Spidops will be struggling to do much damage to any of these Pokemon. On top of these defensive threats, we also have Persimian, which is one of the most viable Pokemon in the tier, and it does have the Defiant ability. So if it switches in on Sticky Web, then it will get an attack boost. So that's also something to bear in mind, that if you see a Persimian, you may want to stack your spikes instead of setting up Sticky Web until Persimian is dealt with. Having said all of this, I've really been enjoying using Spidops in the NU tier, and if you're a Spidops fan that wants to use it in competitive Pokemon, then definitely try out Smogon Single's NU tier. That's all I have to say on this matter. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more content. All that's left to be said is I've been Foo, you've been awesome, and hopefully see you next time. Goodbye.